Olin, the heartbeat of humanity is calling you. I'm here this morning with a talk that will last 40 minutes. Now I'm doing that for a specific purpose, in fact, for a specific person. That person would be my newfound friend and colleague, Jeffrey. Normally, as you may know, I make a practice of trying at least to keep my talks down. If I can get them down to half an hour or ideally 25 minutes, I would be quite pleased. However, considering the material that I'm presenting, it's rather difficult to do that. But today, I'm going to ramble on, and the length of the talk fits the subject. The subject requires some length. And in the course of the talk, I'll tell you a couple of anecdotes, and at the same time, interlaced with those, I'll present some technical information regarding the basis and the technique of Planetary Tantra. So be prepared. This little exposition is going to drag on. And whether or not you can hold your attention to the conclusion, I cannot say. But if you can't, that's too bad for you. Alas, some people just miss out on all the fun. I'll begin with a story from my childhood that involves an ancient artifact, an ancient tool called the telephone. Now, I'm pretty old, and I remember using the telephone when I was a child. The first telephone I used was in the house in Friendship, Maine, where I lived from the age of 4 to 17 or so. The phone was a black plastic phone with a handset, and it was in the hallway of the house leading upstairs to the second floor. I remember the sensation of using the phone. It was a solid object. I could pick it up with one hand, unhook it, take it off the base, put the headset up to my jaw, and I would speak in one part of the headset, and I would hear someone's voice in another part of the headset. Now, bear in mind the difference between this archaic device and the phones used today, which are electronic. When I held the handset and I spoke through one part of it with my voice like I'm speaking now, I heard another voice through the other part of the handset coming into my ear. And that voice came to me in a different way than you hear voices on an electronic phone, such as a cell phone or a smartphone. You see, with the old telephone, the voice of the person at a distance came through immediately by a transformation of sound. So what I heard was the voice of the person speaking transmitted to me, but it was not reproduced by the phone. When you use an iPhone today, the voice you hear is a replication of the voice of the person speaking. You don't actually hear the person. It's like now, you don't actually hear me. You hear a replication. And a feature of modern phones is that they are redundant. Electronic devices electronically reproduce the voice of the person who is present speaking to you. But old phones don't do that. They don't reproduce the voice. They give you a direct rendering of the voice through the mechanism of the phone line. Big difference. I miss phones. I'd love to have a landline. I would consider it to be a great luxury. And I can imagine that some of you listening to me may never have used that kind of phone, and that's too bad, because it's a totally different sensation talking to someone on an old-fashioned telephone. So let's go back to the days when I was living in Friendship, and I would be about 11. I have a vivid memory of one beautiful summer evening when I was in the field across from the schoolhouse in Friendship, the little red schoolhouse where Johnny learned to read and write. And that's where all the trouble began. It was a beautiful summer night, and I found myself out there with a girl who lived in the town. Her name was Sylvester. And she was a super cute, lovely, lively, pixie-like blonde girl. She wasn't a member of the Lash clan. She belonged to other families in the town. Most of the people in the town, about a third of the population, were Lashes, but not Eden. By the way, students of Planetary Tantra who are listening will see that there was some lovely intel encoded into her name, Sylvester. So Eden is, of course, paradise, the place of innocence and beauty without sin. And Sylvester refers to trees. And so Sylvester is a name that goes to that story in the fallen goddess scenario about the population of the earth originally by women and only women. And they were called the arboreal tree nymphs of the first earth, Sylvester. So anyway, I was pretty attracted to her, needless to say. Now, at 11 years old, I hadn't kissed a girl yet. There I found myself on a deliriously balmy summer night, just after dark, and we were running around the field chasing fireflies. And it was filled with them. I remember there was a layer of fireflies, and we just walked through it. They would flit in all directions. We were in that state of semi-ecstasy, which is natural to children. And we were excited and laughing. And I found that as we were running around chasing fireflies together, holding our hands up and cupping our hands to try to capture one, that we would often bump into each other a little bit. And every time I bumped into Eden, I got a thrill. And I could smell her. And she smelled so good. I could smell her hair, her neck, her arms. And it was so tempting to run into her. So I made sure that I bumped into her a little more than I would have. And every time I did, I took a sniff of Eden. I smelled the scent of paradise in a 10-year-old girl. It was a delirious experience, and it stayed with me for a couple of hours. So a few days later, I was walking home from town, and I found myself talking to myself about Sylvester. I was obsessed with her. And as I went along and I passed the Advent Christian Church, I came to a stretch in the road. I remember every inch of that road today as if I were there in a holographic projection. That's called a LMM, a lucid memory moment. And in the moment I'm recalling right now, I was actually talking sort of aloud in a low voice, but I was having a conversation with her. And I was, in a way, rehearsing what I wanted to say to her, which was, I wanted to invite her to go down to the harbor with me so that we could go rowing and we could go out together to one of the beautiful small islands where I often went diving for sand dollars. The islands in the harbor of friendship, like Ram Island and Sand Island. And I wanted to take her out in a rowboat so we could go explore those islands, which were just magnificent. And I'm sure they still are to this day. Now, as I was conducting this rehearsal, talking to her or rehearsing what I wanted to say to her, I noticed that I was also imagining, you could say, her response. So there was a dialogue going on in my head, if you want to use that expression. So I would speak. Sometimes I would speak in a low voice, aloud, and then sometimes I would just not say anything, but I would say the words in my mind, to use the common expression, and then she would respond. So I played both parts of the conversation. Now this action, this activity, this exercise is absolutely common to human animals. It's done all the time. So I got to that place in the road where there's a little dirt road off to the right, and there used to be a sand pit there. And I remember stopping in my tracks right at that place. And I had this realization. It was like I was using a telephone. I was talking to Eden, and I was hearing her talk back to me. So I had an internal telephone. And I realized that the telephone was always there. And I didn't just use it on this occasion to have a conversation with this girl, but of course I used it a lot. But I think it was at that moment that I realized that I was using it. I realized that I had a device installed. And of course I couldn't think very much about that device or how it was constructed or how it was that I had such a device installed in the first place. But I did recognize in a flash that there was something like a telephone operating in my mind. Today, that is called the internal dialogue. Now, sometimes it's called the internal monologue. It functions both ways, on a mono setting and a dia setting. So when you or anyone else talks to yourself on that telephone, it's an internal monologue. You speak and you answer. But when you set it up so that there is a second person involved in the internal monologue, it becomes an internal dialogue. Needless to say, there have been many studies of the phenomenon of the internal dialogue. For instance, investigations into the phenomenon of schizophrenia actually look directly at this mechanism and how it works. But I assure you that no one who has investigated the internal dialogue has told you what I'm going to tell you by the time this talk concludes. Due to having this mechanism by default, it's a factory installation of the human mind. There's a tendency in all human animals to be schizophrenic, and of course we all are schizophrenic, but to certain degrees and in certain ways. It's typically known, and there's a vast amount of literature on this, subject that the schizophrenic hears voices, right? And sometimes he or she hears them so intensely that they sound as if they are external voices speaking to the schizophrenic. Those are called verbal or vocal hallucinations. So the mechanism can function in that way. It can produce vocal hallucinations that seem to be heard externally. But that is an illusion, and it's a sign of mental disturbance. The internal telephone is designed to work subvocally. The voice that you hear is not an external sound, it's an internal sound. The reason why it goes external or appears to be external for schizophrenics is complicated, but largely it has to do to the fact that they are ungrounded in the body. They are not connected to the earth. They are not connected to their basic physical presence in the earth. And due to being ungrounded, it appears as if the telephone is presenting them external signals, you see. But ideally, it doesn't work that way. It's not designed to produce a semblance or illusion of external speech. When that happens, the use of the mechanism has become deranged, or more accurately, the individual using the mechanism is deranged. So there you have an explanation of the many cases which occur, for instance, in religious literature of prophets and saints hearing externally the voice of God or a voice that they attribute to God. It's a malfunction of this internal telephonic instrument, which you can call the diaphonic circuit. Phonic comes from the Greek word meaning voice. Telephone is voice at a distance. Diaphonic means a two-way voice. Your voice speaking internally, another voice responding internally. It is a great wonder of human design that we have this function. And I advise you to consider, if you will agree that everyone has this function, animals have it too, but in a different way than humans. If you will agree, then I invite you to consider that you might not yet have a full conception of the extent to which you can use this function, this special instrument. I don't like to use archontic analogies so much, that is to say, making analogies between the function of the human mind and the function of IT or AI. But sometimes it works for the purposes of illustration. So in this case, I would say that you have a primitive telephone setup, but actually, if you knew how to work it, it would work in a more elaborate and sophisticated fashion than any smartphone that has ever been invented or can be invented. So the old-fashioned telephone is simple in its function. You hear a voice, which is not a replication of a voice, and you can speak to the other person at the other end of the line. Think of all the things that a smartphone can do. It can record, it can take photographs, it can access all sorts of functions or applications. Well, likewise, your primitive diaphonic circuit can do the same. And I hope to have proven that point, or at least illustrated it to you, in the next 20 minutes of this talk. The diaphonic circuit is like any other device, any other tool. You have to learn how it works, even to some degree how it is constructed to work, and then you have to learn how to use it. The starting point for learning how it works is to learn exactly what sub-audible sound is. Sub-audible sound can also be called subvocal sound. Here's an example. Here's a rhyme. Everyone who sees the mother knows right off she is the other. Everyone who sees the mother knows right off she is the other. Da 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 da. Those words in English are the same as words in any language whatsoever, in that they have accents. And you can hear the accents when you say the words, and you can isolate the accents from the words, as I just did, da da da. And when you do that, and you reflect on it, you have the first clue to sub-audible sound, what I call infrasound, which is not exactly the scientific definition in use, but it is even a more exact definition. Infrasound is the sound that occurs in a range of hertz frequencies from 0 to about 20, or somewhere in the range of 20, 25. So the hertz frequency of sound has to be above 20 or 25 before it becomes audible, normally in the range of human hearing. Do you see that? So as you hear my voice now, and you're not hearing my voice, by the way, you're hearing an archontic replication of it. As you hear the sound of my voice, it comes to you in a range of the hertz frequencies that are audible, contrasted to the inaudible. But you still hear the inaudible, even though it's not pronounced openly or externally. The inner telephone is designed to receive and send an inaudible range of sound, infrasound. I can show you a little exercise that demonstrates what I'm saying. Go back to the little verse, which, by the way, is an instruction of Planetary Tantra. Everyone who sees the mother knows right off she is the other. Everyone who sees the mother knows right off she is the other. You heard the second line, but you didn't hear me say it, did you? You heard it because the diaphonic circuit has a recording aspect. It has a recording function. When you memorize something, you are actually using the recording function of that inner telephone. I pronounced the two lines, and after one or two times doing that, you remember them. Why do you remember them? Because the diaphonic circuit has recorded or registered them. And then when I say the first line in a spoken voice, you hear the second line subvocally. That's how it works. It's designed to work that way, and it's a factory installation of the human animal. Now take just a moment, not too long, to emphasize to you that this factory installation, this innate faculty, is material. The structure of it is material, and it's a complex structure. It has three parts. The neuronal circuitry of hearing, which involves the ears and the eardrum, the cochlea, or the spiral formation of the ear. It involves also a second part, which is actually the heart, because the neuronal fibers of the heart are identical to the neuronal fibers of the brain. So you hear with your brain and your heart simultaneously. And between those two material instruments, everything is material, your faculties are material, they're physical. Between those two is the instrument of the Eustachian tubes, which are two empty tubes, hollow tubes that go from your neck up toward your ears. And you can picture them as standing columns of air or horns of air. Due to the fact that they are columns of air, they register pressure of sound. So when you hear everyone who sees the mother, you hear the words in a certain way, your mechanism receives the words. But the air in the Eustachian tubes registers the beats of the words. Da 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 da. Everyone who sees the mother. You see, there are beats, accents, and those beats are like beats on a drum, as if you were to tap a drum with your finger. It registers the beats. The beats in all spoken language and in subvocal language as well register in the Eustachian tubes. So that's the total threefold mechanism of the diaphonic circuit. If you follow this so far, then you will conclude correctly that the mechanism of the Eustachian tubes, those hollow channels filled with air, is quite special due to the fact that it registers beats, whether or not the beats are externally heard or whether they are internally heard. This is a profound key to what is called telepathy. And it is also the first thing that you need to learn to know about the higher functions of the diaphonic circuit. Suppose, for instance, that outside in the world, upon the surface of the earth and within the hermetic bubble of the atmosphere, there are frequencies operating. And they are subvocal frequencies, which some animals can hear. Many animals, in fact. And imagine that these subvocal frequencies are generated by pulsation. So there are pulses of sound, like beats. Now imagine that these subvocal frequencies, which are streaming through the atmosphere, in the air that you breathe, imagine that they strike the Eustachian tubes as if those tubes are like two antennas. That being so, a frequency could register in a series of beats or pulsations on your Eustachian tubes. That happens all the time. And when that happens, you are actually receiving signals, you are receiving a transmission into your diaphonic circuit. But it doesn't first appear in words, it only appears in the sequence of pulsations that go along with those words when they become actual words. So the Eustachian tubes are the antenna of the inner telephone. Follow that? I've laid the groundwork for the basic functions of the diaphonic circuit. And this is not difficult. I mean, what am I describing? Actually, I'm describing events, phenomena of the mind and of the auditory faculties of the human animal that are present in everyone, if they're not damaged. If someone is not damaged neurologically, if they're not damaged in the neuronal circuitry of the heart, and if their Eustachian tubes are functioning correctly, then it's game on. This instrument is working all the time. What I'm going to tell you now will lead or open the way for you to see the higher functions of this circuit. As I said, using the analogy to a horrific device which I despise, which is a smartphone or a cell phone, nevertheless, the diaphonic circuit in its higher sophisticated functions absolutely surpasses any such electronic device. It is an installation of the human animal, of the living animal. It is something alive. AI is not alive. There is no such thing as artificial intelligence. All intelligence is alive, animated, and animating. Now, another term which is helpful to approach this subject is transceiver. So your diaphonic circuit is a transceiver. You receive and you transmit on the same device. It follows then, and you may be a step ahead of me here, that this instrument is the instrument or tool of telepathy. So the human animal is designed with innate telepathic capacities. To some degree, they operate spontaneously, but in the ideal case, you learn how to operate them. You learn how to detect and to control these telepathic capacities and how to direct them consciously. You can do this by mastery of the diaphonic circuit. Now, I've come a long way since that intoxicating evening in the field with Eden Sylvester. And over the years, due to certain experiences I had, I learned, and it was a long process of learning, I learned about the higher sophisticated functions of the inner telephone. I can't possibly go into how that came about. It would take me hours to describe the experiences. So I'll just give you the takeaway. I'll tell you what I learned. And by extension, how I use it today and how you as well can use it if you choose to do so. The basic problem with the diaphonic circuit is that people use it redundantly. Imagine that you had an old-fashioned telephone and you didn't turn the dial with your finger. I would so love to do that once more before I go offside. Turn the dial with your finger, dial a certain number, you hear a dial tone. Well, you hear a dial tone first, then you hear it ringing, and someone answers on the other line. That's how you use an old-fashioned telephone. But imagine that you picked up the headset of the telephone and you didn't dial a number. You just used it to talk to yourself. And then imagine that in the process of talking to yourself, you told yourself in a delusional way that you were talking to another entity like God, or Jesus, or the angels, or the Count of Saint-Germain. That would be like sitting with a headset of an old-fashioned telephone, not calling anyone, and using it to talk to yourself. Well, that's what most people do with the diaphonic circuit if they're ignorant of how to use it otherwise, of how to access its higher functions. Planetary Tantra teaches how to access the higher functions of the diaphonic circuit. And this is what happens when you can do this. You learn, or you discover, that the atmospheric envelope of the Earth, which consists miraculously of around 20% oxygen and almost 80% nitrogen and some other trace elements, is constantly vibrating. It's like a web. It is, in fact, a web. It is the neural web of the Earth Mother. And so you are immersed in her neural web. Trees are continuously transmitting signals of her neural web because trees are the neuronal fibers, the axon and dendron of the living mind of the Earth Mother, the Aeon Sophia. So you are literally in her mind. Everything is material. And as this web of frequencies vibrates continuously, the Aeonic Mother is continually communicating. She is transmitting signals in the range of those subaudible frequencies of the Hertz spectrum. So she transmits frequencies in the range of 0 to 20 or 25 hertz, subaudible sound. But your diaphonic circuit picks up that sound so that you can actually register what she is transmitting. Now, the field of transmission of the Earth Mother is so vast that she cannot reach you through it on one frequency alone. So she breaks down her signal system into 16 discrete frequencies, and you can pick them up on your diaphonic circuit in the same way that you could pick up, say, 16 channels on a radio. And you can receive and transmit in the same system. It's a transceiver. To learn to use this transceiver is one of the arts of Planetary Tantra. First thing that you learn is to identify what the 16 frequencies are. You need a concept of them. Then you practice attunement to the frequencies by following the phases of the moon. And gradually you come to recognize when you are receiving those frequencies and to discern the discrete frequency you are receiving. That is called Dakini instruction. The Aeonic Mother, the Earth, is continually conversing with all animals in all life, and she converses with the human animal in this specific way. She transmits on 16 discrete frequencies. And were you to become an advanced adept of Planetary Tantra, then you would be able to detect 16 frequencies. And you would receive specific intel on each of those frequencies. The practice of Planetary Tantra has that goal. And many have achieved that goal. Perhaps not the full spectrum of 16, but they can detect certain frequencies and they know they are detecting them. And not only that, but the method of Planetary Tantra allows for a system to check and verify that you are indeed accurately and sanely receiving these frequencies, and then you learn to transmit on those frequencies as well. So the diaphonic circuit, which is a factory installation in the human animal, is a planetary transceiving device. 40 minutes and 10 seconds. Enough said, and I'll be seeing you in the beauty to come.